Fanny Wright's biography reads like bad self-insert fiction. Everyone she met adored her, and she was always the main character of every story. Born in Scotland in 1795, then orphaned only 2 years later, Wright inherited a fortune from her father. After her relatives adopted her, they gave her the best education that money could buy. She spent her early years immersed in French philosophy, ancient Greek literature, and the history of political theory. By 18, she'd authored her first book. Soon afterward, she embarked upon a tour of the United States, where she staged plays in Philadelphia and New York City. Wright was in her early 20s when she published a best-selling travelogue about her adventures in America. Its most eager fan was the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who took the young woman under his wing and introduced her to Britain's most prominent intellectuals. Wright's reputation grew so quickly that the Marquis de Lafayette invited her to visit him in Paris. Starstruck by the revolutionary hero of two worlds, she begged the old man to adopt her. When he declined, she made him her lover instead. She didn't care that he was 40 years her senior. Although Fanny Wright's biography is fascinating, it's not actually the subject of this introduction. We're concerned with Wright's friend, Frances Trollope, who lived a quiet, unassuming life until she realized that she wanted to be more than just a minor character in someone else's story. Frances, the daughter of a humble English reverend, married the lawyer Thomas Trollope in 1809, when she was 30 years old. The couple bore 7 children, one of whom, Anthony, eventually became a great Victorian novelist. But that day was far away, and in the meantime, children were expensive and demanding. Trollope frequently regretted that she couldn't live as comfortably as she desired. Above all, she regretted that she couldn't live as comfortably as her brilliant friend, Fanny Wright. Between 1823 and 1827, Trollope repeatedly visited Wright and the Marquis de Lafayette, who lived together in a vast chateau in the French countryside. As she sipped wine and watched the moon rise over lavish gardens, Trollope complained to Wright about her money problems and the strain that they were placing on her marriage. Wright, meanwhile, rhapsodized about a grand investment scheme that she was formulating. She would use her wealth to move to Tennessee, where she would found a cutting-edge utopian community in Neshoba. There, Wright said, she would rent slaves from local planters, employ them to grow cash crops, and use the profits from those crops to buy their freedom. Freed slaves could choose to live and work in her abolitionist utopia, where they could educate their children in a mixed-race schoolhouse. Alternatively, they could emigrate to Haiti or Liberia, where they could join communities of free black people. Either way, Wright promised, racial equality and genuine democracy would flourish, thanks to her benevolent and far-seeing financial investments. While Wright put her plan into action, Trollope sailed home to a struggling marriage. Visiting her friends abroad allowed her to forget the poor state of her family's finances for a short time. The cost of international travel, however, made their economic problems worse in the long term. In 1827, Trollope determined that she could no longer bear to live at home. She informed her husband that she was taking 3 of their 5 surviving children across the Atlantic Ocean to Tennessee. In theory, she was trying to save money on their education by sending them to school in Wright's utopian community. In practice, her voyage to America amounted to a declaration of divorce in everything but name. Unfortunately, the utopian community that Trollope and her children joined at Neshoba disgusted her as soon as she laid eyes on it. The Tennessee landscape was a slimy, smoky waste. The buildings were crude wooden huts. The diet was an endless mash of corn and bacon. Worst of all, Fanny Wright was acting like a total stranger. In dress, look, and manner, Trollope complained, she bore no more resemblance to the Miss Wright I had known and admired in London and Paris than did her log cabin to the Tuileries or Buckingham Palace. Wright's authority as a utopian leader had transformed her personality. Trollope reflected that I never heard or read of any enthusiasm approaching hers, except in some few instances of religious fanaticism. Later in life, Trollope wrote very vaguely about why she terminated her relationship with Fanny Wright. Historians have had to read between the lines to find an answer. Everybody knew that Trollope wanted to abolish slavery. But, in hindsight, it appears that her allyship with black people was predicated on her distance from them. From afar, she found them easy to romanticize. Up close, she found them hard to pity. In other words, Trollope was deeply racist. When she arrived in Neshoba, she recoiled at Fanny Wright's insistence that emancipated slaves were socially and intellectually equal to white people. Trollope maintained that it was good to treat one's inferiors kindly, but she also came to feel that it was irresponsible and even wicked to raise them above their supposedly God-given stations. After spending just 10 days in a community where she had planned to spend 2 years, Trollope packed her bags and took her children far away from Fanny Wright. Before long, someone leaked word about Wright's tolerance of interracial marriage. Scandalized white donors stopped funding her project, and the abolitionist community at Neshoba collapsed. Trollope and her children remained in America for several years after her break with Wright. During this time, she pursued an extramarital affair with a French painter and squandered her savings on a failed attempt to establish a bazaar in Cincinnati. By 1831, her finances were in worse shape than ever, leaving her with no choice except to return to England and move in with her husband again. Trapped once more in a household that exhausted her, Trollope realized that she could either reinvent herself or relinquish all her aspirations to a more fulfilling life. Desperate to make money, she remembered that Fanny Wright had earned a fortune publishing a travelogue about America. Accordingly, in 1832, Trollope published the story of her own American adventures. Like Wright's travelogue before it, Trollope's Domestic Manners of the Americans became a national bestseller. Its success immediately ended her financial woes and ushered her into the ranks of literary superstardom. British reviewers praised the book's vivid imagery, which conjured scenes of lonely farms, thunderous waterfalls, and vast blue skies. Reviewers also sympathized with Trollope's politics. As she portrayed it, the ideal society was one in which the rich and poor smiled warmly up and down the economic ladder at each other. American factory workers, farmers, and slaves all deserved the middle class's charity, provided only that they promised to be humble and hard-working. These ideas seemed commonsensical to most British conservatives. So did Trollope's feeling that democracy was dangerous because it did away with social rank and privilege. Following her first book's runaway success, Trollope spent the rest of her life writing novels and travelogues. Arguably the most important work she ever published was Michael Armstrong, the Factory Boy. This 1840 narrative was the first so-called industrial novel written in English. It was set in Manchester's textile mills, it critically examined the Industrial Revolution, and it concluded that modernity was poisonous to human happiness. I'm pretty confident that I'm one of the only people alive today who's ever read Michael Armstrong. Despite the fact that it inspired an entire genre of fiction, the book has faded into obscurity, and it's hard to find a copy still in print. There's a good reason for this. As the first novel of its kind, Michael Armstrong often feels uncertain of its goals. The book's plot centers on the eponymous factory boy, a child worker whose wealthy patron rescues him from a life of labor in the cotton mills. Scenes that actually depict that labor are surprisingly few and brief. Rather than inviting readers inside factories, Trollope ushers them into the private homes of people who can no longer go to work because they've suffered gruesome injuries in violent accidents. The novel's anti-industrial argument thus pivots on the accusation that mill owners are short-sightedly depriving the British nation of human capital. they're maiming young, healthy bodies that really ought to stay intact and profitable. It's notable that Michael Armstrong repeatedly insists that factory labor is as exploitative and unjust as plantation slavery. Because Trollope was an abolitionist and a racist, it can be hard to parse comments like these. On one level, they suggest that industrialization has perverted the dignity of labor by subjecting freeborn workers to a metaphorical condition of slavery. On another level, however, they seem to allege that industrialization has upended the natural hierarchy of races by reducing white people to the status of black people. Depending on your point of view, Trollope's novel proclaims either that no one ought to be enslaved, ever, period, or that no one ought to be enslaved, especially not white people. To be honest, I don't recommend that you read Michael Armstrong for its literary value. It can't offer you anything that you won't find in later, better industrial fiction by the likes of Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, or George Eliot. Nonetheless, I find Frances Trollope and her work historically interesting for four main reasons. First, her life abounds with tantalizing paradoxes. She was a racist who was also an abolitionist, and a social conservative who defied gender roles to become her family's primary breadwinner. Second, Trollope developed a new kind of political fiction that urged middle-class readers to sympathize with the struggles of working-class laborers. Third, Trollope's biography reveals that Victorian political activism was profoundly intersectional. Abolitionists and factory reformers, not to mention feminists, teetotalers, evangelists, and proponents of animal rights, often found common cause with one another, even if they disagreed about the hows and whys of their agenda. Finally, Trollope reminds us that the socio-economic desperation of the early Victorian period existed very close in time to the material prosperity of the mid-Victorian generation that succeeded it. At first glance, an impassioned social problem novel like Michael Armstrong might seem worlds away from the cozy, self-satisfied prose of a domestic narrative like Anthony Trollope's Barchester Towers. In fact, mother and son wrote these two books, and only 17 years separate them from each other. Culturally and historically, this is analogous to the difference between the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. and the release of Madonna's Material Girl. Today, our subject matter is more MLK than Madonna. In this episode, we'll dive into the bleakest, most economically desperate and politically turbulent time in Victorian Britain's history, the Hungry Forties. Depression, protest, blood, and fire defined the years from 1837 to 1848. Before this decade, reformers dreamed of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. After it, they organized for socialism, scientific racism, and empire. It would not take long for the entire world to feel the consequences. My name is Brian Reinken. Welcome to Episode 6 of Melting into Air. Chapter 1. The Panic of 1837. As we've seen throughout the past 5 episodes, Britain had been socially, politically, and economically unstable since the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. Even as the nation's population rapidly ballooned, enclosure and industrialization increased rates of landlessness and inequality. Unlike many older kinds of poverty, the new kind that emerged under capitalism was structural, not seasonal. It also threatened to devour what had once been relatively prosperous social groups, like textile workers. To quote the words of the historian Eric Hobsbawm, British people in the 19th century discovered that pre-industrial experience, tradition, wisdom, and morality provided no adequate guide for the kind of behavior which a capitalist economy required. The bad situation that we've been exploring grew much worse after the Panic of 1837. That year, the overproduction of cotton, bad investments in failing railway companies, and a credit crunch produced a transatlantic economic slump that gradually devolved into a full-blown economic crash. In Britain, the decade-long depression that resulted was more socially pervasive than the post-war blues that followed Waterloo. Manufacturing declined. Exports fell. As people lost their jobs, poor harvests and high tariffs on foreign grain dramatically increased the price of food. Historians call this period the Hungry Forties for a reason. Depending on the data that you choose to analyze, it's possible to interpret the Hungry Forties as a greater or a lesser economic crisis. Optimistic scholars emphasize that this period was just a temporary downturn situated on a longer upward curve. They note that the 1840s were Victorian Britain's last true bout of economic agony and socio-political unrest. After this decade, metrics like purchasing power, caloric intake, and life expectancy all steadily increased. Scholars who downplay the Hungry Forties' severity also emphasize that not everyone went hungry. Although the wealth gap between Britain's richest and its poorest citizens grew wider, the country's middle class expanded in the meantime. The cotton industry created 70,000 new jobs, and investors in the grip of railway mania continued to pour money into startups. Ultimately, the Hungry Forties experienced slower economic growth than usual, but growth persisted nonetheless. Whereas the Great Depression of 1929 threatened death for industrial capitalism, the Panic of 1837 merely symbolized the system's growing pains. That's the optimistic reading of the Hungry Forties. A more pessimistic way to understand it is to recognize that abstract metrics fail to capture how it feels to live in an economy. Britain's cotton industry created tens of thousands of new jobs, but they weren't necessarily the kinds of jobs that people enjoyed working. Investors in the grip of railway mania continued to pour money into startups, but many of these startups failed and cost entire families their life savings. Setting aside statistics about sector growth, the Hungry Forties' human data are appalling. In 1840, the average household consumption of sugar fell to barely half of what it was in 1800. The average consumption of bread decreased as well. Due to malnutrition and the illnesses it caused, British life expectancy dropped lower in the 1840s than it had been since the time of the Black Death. Parliament was utterly unprepared to solve these problems. The vast majority of MPs were immensely wealthy landowners. They barely understood industrial capitalism, and they barely seemed to care about its victims. In Episode 2, I explored how the Whig government that took power in 1830 framed itself as a modernizing alternative to the deeply conservative Tories. Even the Whigs, however, zealously opposed all measures of reform that threatened to unseat the country's rich and powerful elites. In 1830, barely 3% of Britain's population had the right to vote. Faced with popular demands for universal manhood suffrage, the Whigs agreed to pass the so-called Great Reform Act. Despite its self-congratulatory nickname, it extended voting rights only to an additional 1.5% of men. It also formally disenfranchised all women for the first time in British history. The passage of the Great Reform Act cemented a political alliance between old wealth and new money. In 1834, this alliance enacted the New Poor Law, which created a regime of workhouses. Inside those workhouses, the old, the sick, and the desperate were tormented during life and surrendered for dissection after death. With the benefit of hindsight, it's no wonder that the Hungry Forties grew so dark and dangerous. Once official, legal channels of reform had proved their uselessness, a mass protest movement known as Chartism became the only way for average people to express their grievances. The next chapter of this episode will analyze the first great wave of Chartist agitation. In May 1838, a group of working-class activists pledged themselves to a mission of nonviolent reform by constitutional means. Tragically, just 18 months later, their movement would perpetrate the deadliest day of peacetime unrest in modern British history. Chapter 2. Chartism in 1839. Picture yourself as a young English weaver. 5 years ago, you worked from home in your native village. But when industrial machines remade your trade, they forced you to relocate to an unfamiliar city, where you had to take a job inside a cotton mill. Now, you obey the ringing of a factory bell and toil all day in a hot, noisy room packed with strangers. Your situation worsens when an international financial crisis shakes Britain's economy, spiking the price of food. As your expenses climb, your boss refuses to give you a raise. Instead, he complains that times are hard for business owners too, fires you, and replaces you with a teenage girl, whom he can pay less money for the same amount of work. If you were still living in your village, you might take a walk to clear your head and plot a course of action. In the city, though, you hate to go outdoors. Human waste pools in the streets. Smog stings your lungs when you inhale. You don't have close friends here. And as you lay awake in bed at night, you worry about what will happen if you fail to find a job or a support system. The new poor law threatens needy people with the torments of the workhouse. Maybe your life would be better if you had the right to vote. Unfortunately, like the vast majority of English citizens, you're too poor to qualify for suffrage. The English men and women of the 1830s were never likely to accept these circumstances without struggle. They'd been raised by parents who had come of age while Thomas Paine and other revolutionary intellectuals defended the maxim of no taxation without representation. This radical democratic position had a long-standing history in English culture, and many working-class people wholeheartedly subscribed to it. After the economic slump began in 1837, a radical group called the London Working Men's Association decided that now was the moment to campaign for far-reaching social, economic, and political reforms. One of the group's founders, the cabinet maker William Lovett, drafted a platform that became known as the People's Charter. It proposed 6 points, purposely designed to rewrite Britain's constitution from the bottom up. Point 1. All men over 21 must be enfranchised, regardless of their wealth or social status. Point 2. Elections must use a secret ballot to ensure that no man is coerced to vote against his conscience. Point 3. Property qualifications for national office holders must be abolished so that average people, not just rich ones, can hold seats in Parliament. Point 4. National office holders must receive a salary in order to ensure that average people can afford to sit in government. Point 5. Electoral districts must be resized so that no man's vote carries more weight than another's. Point 6. To keep Parliament responsive to the people's will, new elections must take place each year. These 6 points swiftly became a national sensation, thanks to a tireless and talented publicity agent. Fergus O'Connor was a wealthy Irish landowner, but his good looks, progressive views, and love of showmanship endeared him to the masses across Britain. In 1837, O'Connor founded a newspaper named the Northern Star, which he used as a mouthpiece for the People's Charter. Before long, the Star became Britain's best-selling radical publication, and O'Connor grew into the figurehead for the burgeoning grassroots movement known as Chartism. That movement was officially born in May 1838 at an outdoor rally on Glasgow Green, where activists read the People's Charter out loud before at least 150,000 sympathetic listeners. The Chartists vowed to organize and protest until lawmakers and Parliament enacted all of the Charter's 6 points. Their motto was peaceably if we may, forcibly if we must. Most Chartists were working-class men without voting rights, but otherwise they came from many different walks of life. There were English, Scots, Welsh, and Irish among them. There were artisans, factory employees, miners, farmers, and service workers. There were young people who couldn't save enough money to get married and have children. There were old people nostalgic for the revolutionary creeds of Thomas Paine. There were abolitionists, teetotalers, free press enthusiasts, currency reformers, and people who defended their right to bear arms. There were Christian fundamentalists and agnostic humanists. There were people afraid of the workhouse. There were people who disliked the Tories. There were people who hated the Whigs. There were, inevitably, people looking to get drunk and burn things down. But there were also, above all, people who were new to politics. For these people, Chartism promised an opportunity to build a better country. Given the diversity of early Chartism, it's surprising that the movement ever unified. By the end of 1838, however, a central organizing body had clearly begun to take shape. O'Connor and the Northern Star served as this body's neural network. They built powerful political constituencies by introducing local leaders to each other, and by fusing popular regional causes with the movement's national commitment to the People's Charter. Canvassing, coordinating, and campaigning depended on rigorous and difficult logistical work. As they collaborated for a common goal, the Chartists ceased to be indignant amateurs. They were maturing into a formidable, unofficial political party that served people who'd been legally barred from politics. During the last months of 1838, major Chartist rallies attracted many tens of thousands of participants. The vast majority were nonviolent, which endeared them to a small but growing segment of the English middle class. Predictably, the possibility that Chartism might turn into an interclass alliance made the country's rich and powerful elites very uneasy. At these elites' behest, conservative journalists and politicians started to slander Chartist activists. Often, they resorted to an accusation that remains familiar today. Peaceful protesters blocked public roads, which meant that first responders couldn't reach people in need, which meant those people died, which meant protesters murdered them. This bad faith argument proved totally inadequate to derail Chartism. Soon, the movement grew so powerful that O'Connor set his eyes upon a national Chartist convention. Unfortunately for him, legislation from the French Revolutionary era severely limited British citizens' freedom to assemble. To stay within the limits of the law, the Chartist convention could comprise no more than 49 members, each of whom would need to be elected at a public meeting announced in advance. O'Connor oversaw the entire process, and he even developed an ingenious way to fund it by means of small grassroots donations. Thanks to his help, elections to the convention ran smoothly throughout the winter of 1838-39. Middle-class radicals won approximately one-third of the seats. Working men won the other two-thirds, but they didn't always fill them. For example, George Lovelace, the leader of the Tolpuddle Martyrs, whom we met in episode 2, was elected to the convention without his knowledge or consent. When he discovered what had happened, he refused to take his seat. He knew that the British government despised him, and he had absolutely no desire to return to an Australian penal colony. Lovelace correctly understood that the Chartist convention's mere existence was politically inflammatory. Delegates gathered in a London tavern on February 4, 1839, a date they chose to coincide with the opening of Parliament's annual session. As a result of this provocative choice, the Chartist convention became known as the People's Parliament or the Anti-Parliament. Nobody was sure how lawmakers in Westminster would react to the inauguration of an unofficial rival body just a few minutes downriver. Fearful of government crackdowns, convention delegates behaved professionally. So much so, in fact, that multiple eyewitnesses compared them favorably to real legislators. Here was a group of predominantly working-class people calmly and rationally discussing issues of great importance to the nation. Unlike their so-called betters, they didn't shout or stomp. They were, in every sense, respectable. From the day of its opening session, the Chartist Convention debated how to convince Parliament to enact the 6 points of the People's Charter. Some delegates proposed boycotts on taxed goods like sugar, tea, and coffee. Others proposed a general strike, which they referred to as a national holiday or a Holy Week. As one Chartist delegate proclaimed, "The way to the MPs' brains is through their pockets. Find it." In the end, the delegates decided to refrain from drastic measures that were likely to provoke retaliation. Instead, they agreed to send a politely worded national petition to the lawmakers in Westminster. By calmly asking Parliament to please consider their platform, the Chartists planned to showcase their desire to participate in government, not overthrow it. High hopes for the national petition made March 1839 a cheerful month in Chartist history. All across Britain, activists knocked on doors to gather as many signatures as they possibly could. As hundreds of thousands poured in, O'Connor cautioned the movement's supporters to remember that even 1 million signatures would not dislodge a single troop of dragoons. The convention had staked everything on this petition. What might happen to the Chartists if it failed? Parliament hoped to find out. As lawmakers in Westminster began to feel besieged, the Home Office dispatched spies and saboteurs to infiltrate the Chartists' meetings. Probably not coincidentally, Britain soon witnessed its first major incidents of anti-Chartist violence. On March 22, 1839, a police officer leading a paramilitary mob of conservative citizens pelted a peaceful Chartist demonstration with rocks. 8 days later, a different mob beat the convention delegate Henry Vincent into unconsciousness. Parliament refused to punish policemen who assaulted activists. Thanks to this green light from lawmakers, clashes between police and protesters became more frequent. While Britain teetered on the brink of instability, the Chartist Convention decided that the time had come to present the national petition before Parliament. The document, 3 miles of paper rolled into a cylinder the size of a cartwheel, weighed nearly 700 pounds, and it contained almost 1.3 million signatures, far more than any other document in British history to that date. On May 7, 1839, convention delegates loaded it onto a wagon draped in Union Jacks. This moment might have been politically triumphant. Instead, it was poorly timed. As the delegates heaved and hauled, an absurd and frivolous palace squabble about Queen Victoria's chambermaids nearly toppled the Whig government. Although the status quo eventually prevailed, the Chartists' small handful of radical allies in Parliament now felt that the political climate was too hot to introduce the 6 points for debate. The petition couldn't be presented until things had cooled. To make matters worse, May 7th was a day of rioting in Paris. The outbreak of violence just across the English Channel increased British lawmakers' suspicion of the Chartist movement. Police soon arrested Henry Vincent, the convention delegate who'd been beaten unconscious just a few weeks earlier. This was the first time that authorities jailed a convention leader, but it wouldn't be the last. The Chartist Convention finally presented its petition to the House of Commons on June 14, 1839. The results were utterly embarrassing. Lawmakers actually laughed as they watched the convention delegates struggle to wheel the massive document onto the chamber floor. After that, they ignored the petition entirely. Once the disappointed Chartist delegates realized that nothing meaningful was going to happen, they shuffled awkwardly out of the building. Because the petition was so heavy, they left it behind. Over the days that followed, the mood across the country grew volcanic. Lawmakers who laughed at the petition had treated working men like whiny children. In response to this grave insult, an enraged O'Connor thundered from the pages of the Northern Star that Chartists should light their torches and repair to the hillside, and there remain until the prayer of their petition was granted. This allusion to the famous secession of the ancient Roman plebs, who abandoned their city to put economic pressure on the upper class, hinted that a general strike would force the oligarchs in Parliament to come to terms. In response to the threat of a general strike, Parliament intensified repressive measures. On July 4, 1839, lawmakers dispatched dozens of London police officers to intimidate a major Chartist rally in Birmingham. These officers had no personal ties to the crowd they'd been assigned to supervise, which guaranteed that massive riots broke out once they made arrests. One eyewitness alleged that the police showed a disposition to murder the people. Clashes continued through the night, at which point the British military intervened to help the officers. Law enforcement agents raided Chartist headquarters, where they detained William Lovett, the author of the People's Charter, along with several of the movement's other leaders. Then, 1 week after the violence in Birmingham, Parliament officially refused to consider the Chartists' petition, which was still moldering on the floor of the House of Commons. The vote wasn't even close. 235 MPs said nay, 46 said yay, and more than half abstained. Chartism's future now looked very grim. Many convention delegates had been arrested. Others had been disillusioned. Some of those who still clung on to hope began to organize a month-long general strike that would begin in a few weeks, on August 12th. Their comrades, however, worried that the Chartist movement wasn't ready for this drastic measure. The convention needed more time to rally local union leaders, to pool money to support the workers who would lose their wages, and to energize supporters after the humiliating failure of the national petition. To act prematurely would be to invite disaster. Schisms among the Chartist leadership muddied the movement's agenda at the very moment when it needed to be clearest. As the center failed to hold, something like anarchy was loosed across the country. On July 15th, Birmingham erupted into violence once again. This time, a huge crowd of Chartist sympathizers preemptively attacked police officers and destroyed shops owned by anti-Chartist spokesmen. In Parliament, the conservative Duke of Wellington howled that Birmingham was being sacked and looted like a captured city in a time of war. Meanwhile, O'Connor's Northern Star unleashed a polemic at the anti-Chartist members of the middle class.
It is your intense and blind selfishness that will be remembered in the day of trial. You have not been with us, and therefore you are against us. Your warehouses, your homes will be given to the flames, and one black ruin will overwhelm England.
All this bluster ended with a whimper. When August 12th arrived, the highly anticipated, hotly debated, and hysterically feared month-long general strike began. To everyone's surprise, it lasted 3 days at the very most. In some regions, including Manchester, it was over in 24 hours. Needless to say, it achieved none of its goals. So, what happened? How can we explain the weakest, wettest firework in British history? In short, the Chartist convention had blundered by allowing its delegates to behave too much like professional politicians. During the weeks before the strike, they made false promises to their supporters, shared misinformation, and refused to work with one another. On the day appointed for collective action, no one in Britain was completely sure who would support it or how long it was supposed to last. When the strike inevitably collapsed, a new wave of arrests weakened the Chartist leadership still further. On September 14, 1839, the convention glumly voted to dissolve itself. After one of the most energetic and tumultuous years in British history, Chartism was all but dead and buried. But not quite. After every peaceful method of reform had failed, a small, secret cabal of prominent Chartist leaders began plotting violent insurrection. Historians are still debating who knew what, when they knew it, and why they changed their stories in the years that followed. Nonetheless, we can be fairly sure that 1 day after the convention had dissolved itself, a handful of disgruntled delegates agreed to lead a revolutionary uprising in southern Wales. The plotters didn't circulate specific details very widely, but it seems that many prominent Chartist leaders were vaguely aware that something was about to happen, and that it had something to do with John Frost, a convention delegate who worked in the textile industry. What began in Newport on the night of November 3, 1839, was clearly the result of careful planning. This Welsh town shipped coal and iron to the rest of Britain. It sat at the mouth of the long, narrow Monmouthshire valleys, which were hemmed in by mountains worked by miners. If you were to capture Newport, you could block these valleys, thereby cutting off communication between Wales and England, while also depriving the entire country of essential fossil fuels. The plan that John Frost masterminded was to stage a march on Newport, take it by storm, and use it as a springboard for a national Chartist revolution. During the weeks before the uprising, he and his fellow conspirators rallied the area's miners to their cause. Many were eager to join, but many others balked. Frost warned fence-sitters that they would be destroyed like toads after the uprising began. Some fearful miners locked themselves inside their homes. Others fled the area. Pubs and markets grew eerily quiet. As the sun set on November 3rd, huge paramilitary companies of Chartists marched down from the mountains through the Monmouthshire valleys toward Newport. On they came, wrote one eyewitness, many of them half-drunk, swearing and waving great cudgels, a terrifying mass. The makeshift army carried pikes and rifles, and they conscripted any able-bodied men and boys they found. By the very early morning of November 4th, a workday, the region's blast furnaces had all been extinguished, plunging the valleys into an unfamiliar darkness. By 7 a.m., about 5,000 people had assembled. Then, Frost himself commanded the attack on Newport. His plans went awry very quickly. Frost had never been to battle, and few members of his Chartist army had any military knowledge or experience. Newport, in contrast, was home to the 45th Infantry, a troop of professional soldiers that had plenty of experience suppressing rural protesters. The town's mayor, Thomas Phillips, had also placed 500 special constables on high alert. By 8 a.m., Phillips had mobilized these constables alongside the regular Newport police and the 45th Infantry at an emergency military headquarters inside the Westgate Hotel. As the Chartists descended on Newport, they smashed windows and surrounded the hotel, demanding the surrender of the mayor. Then, suddenly, a shot rang out. Historians don't know who fired it, but the Chartists stormed the building, and the 45th Infantry began to unload volley after volley into their ranks. Somebody shot Mayor Phillips. Smoke blanketed the scene. It stank. It stung the eyes. Furious Chartists were now raging through the hotel's hallways. Frightened soldiers fired blindly through the haze. One survivor later recalled the groans of the dying, the shrieks of the wounded, the pallid, ghostly countenances and bloodshot eyes of the dead, the shattered windows, and the passageways ankle-deep in gore. Despite their passion, the overpowered Chartists never stood a chance. They broke ranks and fled. Some of them, too hurt to walk, crawled away from the Westgate Hotel on all fours. Others, too hurt even to crawl, simply writhed upon the ground and screamed for help. It's very hard to calculate the casualties of the Newport Rising. Mayor Phillips survived his gunshot injury. John Frost disappeared into the night. At least 50 Chartists were severely injured, and 22 were killed on the spot. Others must have died at home from blood loss or infection. We know that many of the dead were buried privately by family members. We also know that the authorities buried at least 10 people secretly, after dark, in unmarked graves. No matter the precise death toll, it's high enough that November 4th, 1839 became the deadliest day of peacetime unrest in modern British history. nothing could better embody how the Chartists' lofty dreams of peaceably if we may had degenerated into the grim reality of forcibly if we must. The Newport Rising symbolized the violent end of Britain's relatively optimistic 1830s. Although the Whig government's reforms had always been half-hearted and inadequate, they nonetheless embodied the political establishment's commitment to the slow, forward march of progress. Many lawmakers had once agreed that in the long run, the Industrial Revolution would inaugurate a new era of prosperity. But as the smoke cleared over Newport in November 1839, the future looked much gloomier. Chartists, Whigs, and Tories all believed that something had gone hideously wrong. Chapter 3. Chartist and Anti-Chartist Culture. It's impossible to understand Chartism without knowledge of landmark events like the Newport Rising and the National Petition to the House of Commons. At the same time, if we remember this movement only as a series of protests and uprisings, then we forget how the majority of people actually experienced it on a daily basis. For ordinary British citizens, Chartism meant poems, songs, and social clubs, raffles, newspapers, and plays staged by amateur dramatists. It was a cultural phenomenon defined by its ability to forge close-knit communities. Many Victorians in the 1830s and 40s were first-generation city dwellers who'd migrated from the countryside in search of jobs. Cut off from traditional social networks, they embraced Chartism as an alternative source of interpersonal connection. The movement offered a holistic, totalizing way of life. People read Chartist newspapers, bought food at Chartist co-ops, and attended Chartist schools. They shopped from Chartist catalogs. They named their children after Chartist heroes and signed letters, "Yours in Chartism." Green and purple were the Chartists' colors. Their symbols included the thistle, the rose, and the beehive. Local Chartist chapters sometimes met in churches. More often, members gathered in a pub or tavern, where they ate meals and offered boisterous toasts. Political convictions notwithstanding, most people became Chartists because it was fun. The vast majority of Chartists, maybe as high as 85%, were men. The movement was predominantly anti-feminist. Women weren't allowed to sign the national petition, and no major Chartist chapter ever seriously contemplated fighting for their right to vote. Nevertheless, most Chartist women wielded influence behind the scenes of public life. They opened their homes for concerts, balls, raffles, tea parties, and soirees where Chartist men could build connections with each other. They also cooked meals for Chartist banquets, and they wrote letters that forged networks between regional branches. These letters remind us that the written word was at the heart of Chartist culture. In 1839, Fergus O'Connor's Northern Star became the most read newspaper in Britain. Like other Chartist periodicals, including the Northern Liberator and the Poor Man's Guardian, the Star published serial novels, song lyrics, and sectarian tracts alongside traditional news stories. By most literary critics' standards, very little of this work makes for great reading. In fairness, it was usually written by amateurs who intended it to be performed out loud before a friendly and intoxicated audience. For example, here's an excerpt from a song that praises the release of Chartist activists from prison. There's colliers and miners and laborers too, gunmakers, stampers, and casters, a few, all bravely united, courageous and true, stand firm to Lovett and Collins. Major Chartist periodicals, like the Northern Star, published content aimed at readers across Britain. In contrast, smaller papers often wrote phonetically, in dialect, for local audiences. I apologize in advance to any listeners from Dorset, where the following piece on universal manhood suffrage first appeared. I'll do my best to read it as it's spelled. Why, Mr. Vincent made it clear why vos dat send up member every year to Parliament, and every man would vote. And when the poor folk got a share in making other lays, they'll take good care to make some good ones var the poor. Ironically, an author who was never actually a Chartist wrote one of the movement's most beloved poems. Thomas Hood's The Song of the Shirt, published in 1843, dramatizes the abject condition of English textile workers. Here's a short excerpt. With fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger, and dirt, and still with a voice of dolorous pitch she sang the song of the shirt. O men with sisters dear, O men with mothers and wives, it's not linen you're wearing out, but human creatures' lives. Two elements of this poem deserve special attention. First, its speaker works from home by hand, not in a factory by means of machines. Instead of romanticizing the pre-industrial economy, Hood recognized that the household textile industry was oftentimes as predatory and exploitative as the factory system that supplanted it. Second, the Song of the Shirt explicitly solicits male readers' sympathy for their sisters, mothers, and wives. The author correctly assumed that most of his readers would be men, and that many of them would feel anxious to reassert traditional gender roles in a rapidly changing economic world. Accordingly, he portrayed women as passive victims in need of male assistance, not as workers with the strength to liberate themselves. In addition to poems and songs, Chartist authors often wrote plays. Many amateur actors, musicians, and stagehands joined the movement primarily because participating in local theater offered them a low-stakes opportunity to make friends. Likewise, many audience members became interested in Chartism mostly because their brother, co-worker, or neighbor had landed a starring role in the latest stage production. Due to their broad appeal, Chartist dramas were integral to the movement's fundraising initiatives. Approximately half their profits were repurposed to cover legal expenses or bail fees for arrested protesters. Buying tickets was a fun and easy way to donate to the cause. Chartist dramatists wrote pantomimes, burlettas, farces, comedies, and melodramas, all of which were popular with working-class viewers. Above all, though, the Chartists authored plays about historical rebellions and conspiracies. These plays tended to interpret violence as a rational defense against state tyranny. For example, take the 1841 production John Frost, a play in 5 acts. Its author, John Watkins, drew heavily on the example of Shakespeare's Macbeth to reenact the Newport Rising, which had occurred just 2 years earlier. In this telling, John Frost is a tragic hero. Despite his reluctance to kill, he deigns to risk his life, his reputation, and even his soul for the sake of England's workers. The play begins with the following monologue. Freedom, ye slaves! Oh, when will man be free? Are freeborn Britons slaves of foreigners? Robbed of the rights their fathers did bequeath, have they not spirit to regain their own? Will they, like beasts, drudge on their native land while tyrants lord it o'er them at their ease? Oh, will they yet toil on and pine and die, famished, forlorn, in sight of food and joy, mocked by the rulers that usurp their all? Who gave one man the power to rule another? 'Twas man himself. Man's brother is his master, nor rules except to gorge on right, his prey. Man toils not for himself, but for his wronger. Watkins' play proved very controversial, and not just because its poetry was doggerel. The main problem was the fact that its protagonist had recently committed treason. Many Chartist outlets denounced the production because they didn't want the general public to associate their movement with the Newport Rising. Many other outlets denounced it simply because Watkins was a moody egomaniac. On one notorious occasion, he raged that his critics were grubs who deserved to be killed. Unsurprisingly, this outburst failed to win him any friends. Today, few people read Chartist literature. Most explicitly political art becomes outdated very quickly, and it tends not to be preserved unless establishment interests support it. Chartism didn't outlive the 1840s, and it didn't usually endear itself to the middle-class tastemakers who developed national reading lists and college syllabi thereafter. A handful of middle-class novelists, including Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell, encountered working-class Chartists in their social circles. Even so, these interclass political friendships were often tense, awkward, and fragile. The majority of middle-class writers were openly hostile to radical change. In Episode 1, we met the Scottish firebrand Thomas Carlyle, whose 1829 essay, Signs of the Times, critiqued the advent of machinery in sulfuric prose. You'll remember that Carlyle was a close friend of the utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill. The two men bonded over their commitment to social reform. But as the years passed, it became apparent that they understood that term in very different ways. During the 1830s, Mill enthusiastically embraced the Whig establishment, including the New Poor Law and the workhouse. Carlyle, on the other hand, became increasingly embittered with the Whigs, whom he perceived as cold, incurious materialists tallying births and deaths among the English poor like they were surveying a herd of cattle. Despite their political differences, the writers remained very dear to one another. In 1835, Carlyle sent Mill the only complete manuscript of his latest book project, A History of the French Revolution. Unfortunately, Mill's housemaid mistook the manuscript for trash, and she destroyed the entire work by using it to light a fire in the hearth. It's a measure of Carlyle's genuine affection for Mill that he didn't allow this accident to derail their friendship. Instead, he rewrote the entire book from scratch, which took him 2 full years. Carlyle finally published his History of the French Revolution in 1837. While a financial crisis strangled the British economy, he denounced the radical values of liberty, equality, and brotherhood as perilous delusions that created human misery and called it progress. In theory, he had written an assault upon the French. In practice, he had written an assault upon modernity, upon reformers, and upon the Whigs. His book imagined history as a tale of great men vying with angry mobs. It alleged that once you strip away the glitter and the romance from the discourse of natural law, what remains is a self-serving sham concocted by ambitious weaklings looking to promote themselves above their proper social stations. In this context, Carlyle narrates the history of the French Revolution at a ranting, raving, almost hysterical pitch that treats the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen with the same fury that today's historians might reserve for the gas chambers of Auschwitz or Treblinka. Here's a passage from his account of Louis XVI's public execution.
Sharp was the death hail rattling round one's flag of truce on that Bastille day, but it was soft to such wreckage of high hope as this, one's new golden era going down in leaden dross and sulphurous black of the everlasting darkness. At home, this killing of a king has divided all friends, and abroad it has united all enemies. Fraternity of peoples, revolutionary propagandism, atheism, regicide, total destruction of social order in this world. All kings and lovers of kings and haters of anarchy rank in coalition as in a war for life.
Although Carlyle practically foams at the mouth when denouncing state-sanctioned violence against the French royal family, he rhapsodizes about the counter-revolutionary vigilante Charlotte Corday, who murdered the journalist Jean-Paul Marat. Corday is a beautiful and stately apparition who slays an atrocious enemy of humankind. Carlyle quotes her courtroom defense at length, insisting that it's just to kill one man to save 100,000. Here, we see the underlying thesis of his history. Killing one man to preserve the status quo is honorable. Killing one man to upend it is a mortal sin. The Newport Rising confirmed Carlyle's hostile attitude toward revolution. In December 1839, he published a tract titled Chartism. In that tract, he expressed his sympathy for the exploited poor, and he warned the British government to abolish the workhouse. He didn't do this purely for the sake of pity, though. To the contrary, he worried that the workhouse made the Chartist cause more powerful and righteous. If that cause were left to grow unchecked, then anarchy and bloodshed would take hold across the country, and, as he said, our own French Revolution would become inevitable. Carlyle insisted that what he called the condition of England rested upon the next few years. Ultimately, his arguments made little to no impact on Britain's domestic policies. Even so, his tract on Chartism circulated widely among readers, and it became a cultural milestone in the history of the Hungry Forties. Above all, his memorable reference to the condition of England became a kind of English proverb. For the remainder of the 19th century, writers and reformers would invoke this phrase to diagnose their country with a dangerous illness and to propose treatment regimens of their own unique design. In the next chapter of this episode, we'll examine one such regimen. After the Newport Rising, Chartism endured a wave of government persecution that nearly destroyed it. By 1842, however, the downfall of the Whigs and a new downturn in the national economy had revitalized the Chartist movement, which became larger, stronger, and more radical than ever before. This development seemed to prove Carlyle's prophecy right. Chartism now looked exactly like Britain's French Revolution. Chapter 4. Chartism in 1842. As evening fell on November 4th, 1839, John Frost's failed Newport rebels slunk away to hide or die. Frost, who'd fled the slaughter ground in tears, was soon arrested at a nearby printer's house. Over the following days, law enforcement detained hundreds of other people on flimsy charges. These people were incarcerated in the Newport workhouse. In a grim but fitting piece of symbolism, the city's mayor had repurposed it as a makeshift prison. Many suspects had to be released because there was no evidence that linked them to the rising. On December 11th, however, Monmouth Courthouse charged 16 prisoners, including Frost, with high treason. Another 24 people were charged with crimes including sedition, conspiracy, and burglary. All of them were scheduled to stand trial on the last day of the year. Meanwhile, ordinary Chartists across Britain found themselves the objects of mistrust. Although the overwhelming majority of them had absolutely nothing to do with a conspiracy against the state, Frost's actions had tainted their movement. As the British public tore itself into a dozen different factions over disagreements on the ethics of political violence, the Newport trials became heavy with cultural meaning. Fergus O'Connor, the pro-Chartist editor of the Northern Star, scrambled back and forth around the country to raise money on behalf of the accused. In contrast, Queen Victoria invited Newport's mayor to a private dinner in her palace. The British royal family clearly hoped to find the rebels guilty on all charges. When the trials opened on December 31st, 1839, rumors swirled that radical Chartists were plotting a second rebellion. Fear of the so-called January Uprising may have inspired Thomas Carlyle to publish his treatise on Chartism, which appeared around this time. It also may have swayed the outcome of the Newport trials. On January 8, 1840, the jury took just half an hour to reach a guilty verdict for John Frost. But then, after this ruling, the prosecution unexpectedly dropped many of its charges against the other defendants. Having convicted the Newport Rising's leader, they apparently wanted to defuse the nation's political tension by letting most followers walk. If this was their plan, it succeeded. Chartist news outlets, including the Northern Star, encouraged their readers to accept the Newport trial's outcome as legitimate. They also denounced the rumored January uprising and condemned political violence. Although several small, isolated Chartist riots broke out on January 12th, they were nothing on the scale of what conservatives had feared. On January 16th, John Frost, Zephaniah Williams, and William Jones, all of whom had helped to orchestrate the Newport Rising, were sentenced to death by hanging, drawing, and quartering. Frost immediately filed an appeal, and the Chartists started drafting a petition for a royal pardon. Although this petition gathered more than 100,000 signatures in only a few days, the court upheld Frost's conviction, and the Prime Minister's cabinet unanimously agreed that he should die. Faced with an unreceptive government, the British working class grew absolutely furious with the Whigs, whom they portrayed as murderers of the Christ-like Frost. Britain's Lord Chief Justice privately advised the government to spare the lives of the condemned in order to forestall a revolution. Thanks to his intervention, Frost, Williams, and Jones were transported to a prison in Tasmania instead of being hanged. This outcome was a Pyrrhic victory for Chartism. As political moderates and the middle class abandoned the movement in droves, it became smaller, poorer, and far more schismatic. Its leaders tried to breathe life back into the cause by advertising the 6 points and publicizing flashy controversies centered on the royal family's spending habits. Despite these efforts, Chartism's fortunes kept falling. In May 1840, O'Connor stood trial on the charge of publishing seditious libel in the Northern Star. The jury only took 10 minutes to decide that he was guilty. Luckily, the judge sentenced him to prison, not the gallows. Chartism's leaders were now overwhelmingly behind bars, or in exile, or both. The decapitated movement flailed and spasmed through the second half of 1840. In July, for instance, Manchester Chartists organized the so-called National Charter Association, or NCA. Recognized today as the first national political party in English history, it relied on small donations from working-class subscribers rather than a few enormous grants from wealthy patrons. The NCA abided by a written constitution, and it welcomed any members who embraced the basic tenets of the People's Charter. In theory, it might have unified the fractious Chartist movement. In practice, it deepened the fractures. The NCA's big tent approach to membership meant that its supporters often disagreed on fundamental principles. One sect, the teetotal Chartists, argued that workers who drank alcohol should remain disenfranchised because they couldn't be trusted to think rationally on election day. Another sect, the knowledge Chartists, believed that the 6 points could only be enacted safely once the working class had improved itself by means of education. O'Connor shrieked against both of these sects in angry letters that he smuggled out of prison. Britain's most powerful reform movement had now degenerated into the equivalent of an unmoderated internet forum. By mid-1841, Chartism was finally beginning to reorganize itself. When a new Chartist convention assembled in London in May, it gathered more than 1.3 million signatures for a national petition demanding the pardon of the Newport Rising's leaders, all of whom were still imprisoned in Tasmania. The petition failed, but that summer saw the Whig Party lose power. Rather than passing bold reforms to resuscitate Britain's economy, the Whigs had spent the last 4 years suppressing protesters at home while promoting capitalism and imperialism abroad. In 1838, their policy of regime change in Afghanistan had dragged Britain into a long, unwinnable guerrilla war. 1 year later, Britain had invaded China to defend a private corporation's right to peddle opium. Fallout from these two notorious conflicts, and frustration with the economic crisis that they failed to remedy, led to a vote of no confidence against the Whig Prime Minister Melbourne in June 1841. In turn, that vote triggered a general election, during which many Chartists voiced support for Tory candidates. At first glance, an alliance between Chartists and Tories might appear absurd. After all, most Tory politicians were deeply conservative landowners who despised revolution and obstructed parliamentary reform. Insofar as Chartists were political activists, they were the Tories' natural enemies. Having said that, the Tory party also mistrusted modernity in general, and industrialization in particular. Insofar as Chartists were the victims of the factory and the coal mine, they were the Tories' natural allies. We should also remember that ordinary Chartists hated the Whig Party, whose leaders had denied them the right to vote, menaced them with workhouses, and sentenced their leaders to death or deportation. True, there was no compelling reason to expect that Tories would treat Chartists any better, but their record seemed cleaner, if only because they hadn't had the chance to stain it yet. In Chartist eyes, the Tories' strongest argument was, "We're not the Whigs." Often, that was good enough. Few ordinary Chartists had the right to vote in national elections, but many of them lobbied for the Tory party. When that party won a parliamentary majority, the new Conservative Prime Minister, Robert Peel, assumed office on August 31st, 1841. Although Chartists initially celebrated the Whig Party's downfall, they soon realized that Tory rule had the potential to be even worse. As we saw in Episode 2, Peel was known to be a policy wonk, but also a smug, self-righteous, and arrogant man even by upper-class standards. When he took office as Prime Minister, his government supported a few minor industrial reforms designed to spite Whig business magnates. On the question of grain tariffs, though, most Tories utterly opposed all change. While ordinary people all around the country started missing meals, wealthy conservatives in Parliament defended policies that artificially inflated food prices. As a result, the economic crisis that had started 4 years earlier quickly grew worse under conservative mismanagement. Bankruptcy rates increased, industry receded, workers suffered layoffs and wage cuts. 1842 became the worst economic year of the entire Victorian era. Barely 6 months into Peel's administration, people were already burning him in effigy. Fergus O'Connor, who received a hero's welcome when he was released from prison late in 1841, took advantage of the country's sudden economic downturn to make Chartism a national platform again. By downplaying the movement's connections to the Newport Rising and emphasizing its history of peaceful, legal protest, he endeared it to the middle class, which felt the sting of unemployment and high food prices. Buoyed by a growing base of moderates, O'Connor and the NCA drafted a new national petition asking Parliament to consider the Charter's 6 points. The 1842 petition gathered 3.3 million signatures, more than twice as many as its hugely popular predecessor. To put that figure in perspective, it amounted to 1/3 of Britain's adult population, or more than 3.5 times the total number of people who had voted in the 1841 elections. Chartism now had more supporters than the Constitution it was trying to reform. Delegates from the National Chartist Convention presented the petition to the House of Commons on May 2, 1842. 7 marching bands and a crowd of at least 50,000 people accompanied them on their way to Parliament. When the procession arrived at the Palace of Westminster, it discovered that the petition, 6 miles of paper bundled into a gigantic roll, was literally too big to fit through the door of the building. The delegates had to disassemble it to carry it inside. Then, once they brought it to the floor of Commons, they realized it was bigger than the desk they were supposed to put it on. This happy accident amounted to a masterstroke of showmanship. Nothing could more clearly symbolize the people's will. Unfortunately for the Chartists, Britain's rulers still didn't care about the people's will. Only 1 day after the petition was presented, lawmakers decisively struck down a motion to consider it. The defeat was even more dramatic than in 1839. 287 MPs voted nay, and just 49 voted yea. Those opposed to the petition cynically argued that universal manhood suffrage would result in the confiscation of property, famine and pestilence, and, ultimately, the rise of a strong military despot who would seize power like Napoleon Bonaparte in revolutionary France. In 1839, the British people had been shocked to learn that Parliament rejected their petition. In 1842, however, they expected nothing else from oligarchic rulers. Therefore, they prepared themselves for more dramatic action. The 1842 general strike has become a milestone in the history of British labor. Although it began almost spontaneously, it soon grew into the gravest threat that Chartists ever posed to social order. In early June, a group of colliers in Staffordshire, near Birmingham, peacefully protested wage cuts. Over the following weeks, the protests grew steadily larger, until, one day in July, colliers all across the region went on strike. They warned that the nation would have no more coal until their bosses promised them a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. News of the strike spread nationwide, and labor activism proved to be contagious. Colliers, bricklayers, carpenters, weavers, cobblers, tailors, mechanics, smiths, and many other workers all laid down their tools in 32 counties across Britain. The breadth and scale of labor activism shocked the Chartist leadership, which hadn't organized these strikes or even thought that they were possible. Suddenly, convention delegates in London found themselves scrambling to keep pace with grassroots activists and union leaders in the provinces. The strikers' demands varied by region and trade, but the vast majority declared that work wouldn't resume until Parliament enacted the 6 points. From one perspective, this was excellent news for the NCA. It meant that Chartism and labor activism had become synonymous. From another perspective, the scale and passion of the labor demonstrations frightened many Chartist leaders. They found themselves riding a tiger, and they had no idea how to dismount. As more and more laborers walked off the job, the strikers' mood became ebullient. A sparsely punctuated letter written by an unknown mill worker captures this moment's overwhelming optimism.
Now is the time or never. Lose this opportunity and we are lost. Lost! Lost! Soldiers are ready to fight for the people. Police the same. Now's the time for liberty. We want the wages paid. If they won't give it to us, revolution is the consequence. We have stopped every trade. Not a cart is allowed to go through the streets.
The strike's early idealism proved short-lived. As work stoppages entered their second week, peaceful protesters lost wages and went hungry, which transformed them into angry rioters. Large mobs looted and burned workhouses, police stations, and the homes of government officials, not to mention private shops and grocery stores. Some strikers, who were shocked by the violence, defended their good reputation by accusing looters of being undercover police officers looking to cause trouble. At the same time, police officers justified heinous crackdowns on assembly by arguing that protesters were professional agitators trafficked into local villages from out of town. By mid-August, the situation was degenerating into a rancid concoction of anarchy and tyranny. Clashes between rioters and law enforcement agents radicalized both sides. Soldiers freely opened fire on the protesters. In response, protesters brandished pikes and used them to display mock severed heads in the form of bread loaves soaked with animal blood from slaughterhouses. Carlyle's prophecy that Chartism would become Britain's French Revolution now seemed on the verge of coming true. High-ranking Chartist leaders found themselves in a tight spot. Although the general public blamed the country's violence on official Chartist policy, the general strike had never been the NCA's idea, and they had very little power to control its outcome. Rather than giving orders, Chartist leaders spent their days fearing that police would scapegoat them for actions that they'd never authorized, coordinated, or approved of. O'Connor, for example, deliberately toned down the Northern Star's inflammatory rhetoric because he didn't want to go to jail for treason. Other Chartist leaders tried to rein in looting at a local level, only to find that, by doing so, they angered many of the looters, who perceived them as sellouts and traitors. For what it's worth, most of the general strike's participants were nonviolent. As in any protest, though, the loudest voices drew the most attention, and the front-page news loved nothing more than blood. No serious historical account of 1842 should overlook its violence, but nor should any serious account forget that ordinary Chartists were dismayed to see rioting and looting overshadow peaceful demonstrations for political reform. Like the three-day strike of 1839, the general strike of 1842 ended abruptly and without fulfilling any of its goals. On August 20th, the Northern Star published an editorial urging Chartists to accept the fact that they had failed. Their original message had been lost. The middle class had turned against them. People had been jailed, injured, and killed. Over the following month, most of the strikers, peaceful or otherwise, gave up and returned to work. By October 1st, the status quo had been restored. In hindsight, the general strike had burned too hot too fast. Workers became unreasonably excited. They expected immediate victory, and when it failed to materialize, they grew disillusioned. The ruling class had also learned the lesson of the Newport Rising 3 years earlier. As soon as the 1842 general strike became violent, police and military leaders acted quickly and with savage prejudice to put it down. Their actions divided the strikers, who squabbled with each other about goals and tactics rather than uniting under pressure. Their would-be leaders in the NCA consistently remained ambivalent toward the protests, and they failed to rally workers in important cities like Birmingham and London. Above all, the harsh reality of hunger killed the general strike. Because the movement had sprung up spontaneously, no central coordinating agency had the time to mobilize the resources required to sustain it. In a more trusting world, middle-class grocers and shopkeepers might have filled the void by offering workers store credit. Instead, the prevalence of looting made them hostile to the strikers' goals. Once the strikers' savings dried up, they went hungry. Some men were prepared to starve themselves to death for the 6 points. But would they starve their wives and children too? The answer was usually no. As summer turned to fall, nature itself appeared to intervene against the general strike. The 1842 harvest was the most abundant that Britain had seen in a decade. Once the price of bread dropped sharply, even low-paid workers could afford to eat again, which made work stoppages look less appealing. Offered the choice between a police baton and a hot meal, most strikers naturally preferred the meal. The general strike's failure devastated Chartism even more than the disastrous Newport Rising. As the middle class turned on the protest movement, at least 1,500 people were arrested in northwest England alone. The legal fees associated with their trials drove the NCA to the verge of bankruptcy. By this point, it was politically irrelevant anyway. Chartism had suffered 2 humiliating failures in 3 years. Trust is a finite resource, and the British working class was tired of expending it on causes that seemed doomed to fail. By autumn 1843, sales of the Northern Star had fallen by 40%, and there were fewer Chartist newspapers than there had been since 1838. 5 long years would pass before the movement finally remobilized for one last, desperate push against the British Constitution. But that's a story for a future episode. Today, historians often ask why Victorian Britain never had a revolution. I think that there's a better way to frame this question, though. Rather than comparing Chartism to uprisings in continental Europe, and, implicitly, asking why Chartists failed to take the kind of radical action that succeeded elsewhere, I think that we should ask what about Britain's unique political climate allowed Chartism to operate the way it did. For example, Britain enabled ordinary citizens to voice their grievances through petitions, rallies, and newspapers. Seen from this perspective, Chartism's comparative nonviolence didn't indicate its lack of political conviction. Instead, It reflected the fact that Britain, despite its frigid oligarchy, was more liberal and democratic than most other European states. The Chartists always wanted to participate in government, not overthrow it. Unlike revolutionaries on the continent, they could still imagine that reform might be a peaceful process. In the broader context of the 19th century, Chartism was a moderate or even somewhat conservative political movement. Almost all of its members were men. They supported traditional gender roles, the nuclear family, and the Christian faith. Although they wanted fairer hours and better pay, they never organized against the right to private property. With their emphasis on free speech, free assembly, and the freedom of the press, with their liberty caps and tricolor flags, with their commitment to the right to bear arms and their maxim of no taxation without representation, the Chartists were the last great embodiment of an 18th century radical culture that drew heavily on the ideas, images, and tactics of the American and French revolutions. European radical culture would look very different after 1848, when Chartism suffered its final defeat, and when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto. Starting in the second half of the 19th century, the working class would rally under a red flag. Of course, no one living in the hungry 40s knew what would come next. They knew only that the Newport Rising and the 1842 general strike had turned most members of the middle class against the Chartist cause. In the remainder of this episode, we'll explore the cultural fallout of the rupture between Britain's radicals and its more cautious moderates. Up next, it's class solidarity versus Christmas spirit in what's arguably the most beloved British novel of all time. Chapter 5. Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. January 20th, 1843. As Chartist leaders stand trial for their role in the general strike, Edward Drummond, personal secretary to Prime Minister Robert Peel, trudges through the slush toward Downing Street after his lunch break. He shivers in the winter cold. He yawns. In only a few hours, he can go home. The bullet enters through his back. He collapses on the street. As his blood pools around him, he worries that his boss will wonder why he's taking so long to return from lunch. 5 days later, Edward Drummond dies. His shooter was Daniel Macnaghten, a 30-year-old Scottish woodworker who'd mistaken him for the Prime Minister. Some kind of mental illness, possibly paranoid schizophrenia, had led Macnaghten to believe that he was being gang-stalked. During his trial, he told the jury that the Tories in my native city have compelled me to take action. They follow me, persecute me wherever I go, and have entirely destroyed my peace of mind. Macnaghten's case became a landmark moment in British legal history after his lawyers proved him not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead of a prison, he was confined to Bethlehem Hospital, better known as Bedlam, until the last year of his life. The judge's ruling scandalized the nation's rich and powerful. Embittered by 4 years of Chartist activism, they seized upon Macnaghten's case to vent their pent-up anger. The Tory press insisted that his mental illness was a sham. Queen Victoria complained that his sentence wasn't harsh enough. The House of Lords publicly questioned the judge's competence. To say the least, the whole affair was an unpleasant way to ring in 1843. It all profoundly unsettled Charles Dickens. He and his wife were raising 4 small children, whose futures he dwelt upon nervously. What would life be like in England by the time his sons and daughters came of age? Like his close friend Thomas Carlyle, Dickens sympathized with the plight of the nation's poor, but he also perceived labor activism as a form of demagoguery that threatened to plunge England into revolution. 1843 began with Chartist trials and political murder. As it dragged on without improving, Dickens began to feel his country needed guidance. It had lost its way. The same thing could be said of his career. Dickens' first 2 novels had been instant classics. In the 5 years since Oliver Twist, however, he'd begun to flounder. Although he remained Britain's best-loved novelist, his most recent output was less popular than his early work. Have you read or even heard of Master Humphrey's Clock? What about Barnaby Rudge? Martin Chuzzlewit? Almost all of Dickens' biggest duds date from the early 1840s. This was his low point as an artist, and he knew it. As he sat down to write in autumn 1843, he wanted to revitalize the British nation and his reputation in one stroke. Dickens was a sentimental man and a shrewd marketer. As the holiday season approached, he hammered out a book in just 6 weeks. The result, A Christmas Carol, was deliberately designed to make it an attractive gift. Lavishly decorated with gilt lettering and full-page illustrations, the slim, salmon-colored volume appeared on shelves on December 17th. Readers immediately adored it. By Christmas Day, it had sold an astonishing 5,000 copies, and its publishers were already preparing a second run. A Christmas Carol almost single-handedly saved Dickens' career. Even today, it's arguably the most beloved British novel of all time. When the story opens on the morning of December 24th, Christmas Eve, the old miser Ebenezer Scrooge is as hard as flint and as solitary as an oyster. He owns a counting house in London, where he mistreats his only employee, the kind-hearted family man Bob Cratchit. Scrooge dismisses Christmas as a humbug. When charity workers solicit holiday donations for the poor, he berates them and turns them away. That night, while eating a lonely dinner in his empty mansion, Scrooge hears a clanking sound approaching from the cellar. Soon, he sees the ghost of Jacob Marley, his old business partner. Marley drags a heavy chain that he forged link by link and yard by yard through greedy acts in life. He warns Scrooge that his chain will be even heavier, unless he mends his selfish ways. "Tonight," says Marley, "you will be haunted by 3 spirits. Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread." That night, the first spirit visits Scrooge. Simultaneously old and young, but neither male nor female, the ghost of Christmas Past shows him a series of bittersweet images from his boyhood, including a vision of his deceased sister. Scrooge encounters his first boss, kind old Fezziwig, who always hosted lively Christmas parties. He then reflects upon his first love, Belle, and how he lost her heart by gradually succumbing to his greed for worldly wealth. After the ghost of Christmas Past fades away, Scrooge meets the jolly, earthy ghost of Christmas Present. The spirit takes Scrooge to the Cratchit household, where they observe a poor but loving family cooking Christmas dinner. Scrooge grows immensely disturbed by the sight of Tiny Tim, the Cratchit's youngest child, who walks with a crutch and seems weak. The ghost of Christmas Present warns him that the boy will surely die of illness if the future stays unchanged. Before the ghost of Christmas Present disappears, Scrooge spots a hideous foot or claw poking out from underneath the spirit's robe. The spirit then reveals 2 yellow, ragged, meager, wolfish, scowling children, whom he names Ignorance and Want. They are the images of modern Britain's doom. Scrooge, solemn and contemplative, now greets the shrouded, silent ghost of Christmas yet to come. The spirit takes him to a filthy rag and bottle shop, where house servants gloat over their cruel employer's death. Next, the spirit takes Scrooge to the Cratchit house, where Tiny Tim has died. Finally, it takes him to a graveyard, where it points wordlessly at a neglected headstone. The horrified Scrooge reads his own name inscribed upon it. He pleads with the ghost of Christmas yet to come. "I am not the man I was. I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on that stone." Suddenly, he awakens safely in his bed on Christmas morning. Rushing outside, he wishes everyone he sees a happy holiday, and he donates money to the charity workers whom he had berated on the day before. On December 26th, Scrooge gives Bob Cratchit a raise and vows to treat him better in the future. The narrator confirms that Scrooge became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as anyone on earth. Tiny Tim survives and thrives thanks to his kindness. And so, the book famously concludes with Tim's words,
God bless us, everyone!
I love A Christmas Carol. Sometimes, though, our familiarity with and fondness for a work of art can make it hard to recognize for what it really is. Over the next few minutes, I want to situate this novel as a product of its time, to test the limits of its worldview and its sympathy. In doing so, I hope to help us understand it better. Let's start with the fact that Dickens packs his narrative with details. Scrooge is said to be a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Marley drags cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. The ghost of Christmas Present feasts upon sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, and cherry-cheeked apples. Contrary to a popular misconception, Dickens was never paid by the word. Instead, his crowded sentences serve a deliberate thematic purpose. By evoking a crowded world, they insist that nothing exists in isolation. Everything connects to something else. Light spills from the windows of old Fezziwig's Christmas party, illuminating the street outside. The Cratchit children smell their Christmas dinner wafting from the kitchen. In this novel, joy is social. Joy is shared. Joy ensures that no man is an island. But what about the man who tries to shut himself away from humankind? The narrator suggests that Scrooge lives an unnatural life. For all intents and purposes, he's already a ghost. Given that human life is all about connection, A Christmas Carol reaches out and touches the key social issues of its day. For example, the novel vocally opposes the Whig Party's economic policies. When a gentleman asks him to donate to the poor, the greedy Scrooge replies, "Are there no prisons?" "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman. "And the union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are." "Still," returned the gentleman, "I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor, then?" said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid, from what you said at first, that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge's reference to the surplus population identifies him as a devotee of the economist Thomas Malthus, and probably a supporter of the Whigs. His readiness to condone the misery and death of so-called idle people is the most heinous sign of his depravity. The offended ghost of Christmas Present later throws his words back in his face. "Are there no prisons?" the spirit demands, while Scrooge cowers at the horrifying sight of ignorance and want. "Are there no workhouses?" The scene with these two needy children fiercely condemns A Christmas Carol's comfortable middle-class audience. Imagine that you've bought this richly illustrated book, which wasn't cheap, as a holiday present for your young sons and daughters. Imagine reading it to them on Christmas morning. Imagine that the room is full of new toys and hot food. Now, imagine coming to the episode of ignorance and want. What will your children ask you? How will you answer their questions? For as often as Dickens disturbs his middle-class readers, he also takes measures to comfort them. Despite the fact that A Christmas Carol was published after several consecutive years of Chartist agitation, Chartism is conspicuously absent from the story world. Bob Cratchit doesn't like his boss, but he never joins a union, and he certainly never protests in the streets. When Mrs. Cratchit complains about Scrooge over Christmas dinner, Bob urges her not to say such things in front of the children. This scene implies that employers deserve respect and gratitude from their employees. Dickens readily concedes that some bad bosses do exist, but he also maintains that hierarchy as such is necessary and desirable. Under these circumstances, social change must flow from the top down rather than the bottom up. The spirits descend to save Scrooge, who then descends to save the Cratchits. This structure of reform preserves established hierarchies instead of toppling them. At the end of the novel, nothing about Britain's social, political, or economic structure has changed, but we're meant to understand that the world has been set right because a single wealthy citizen is willing to do good. The book's penultimate paragraph praises Scrooge as both a master and a man. These words confirm that he deserves to remain a patron and a patriarch even after his surprising change of heart. Bob Cratchit gets a raise, but it seems improbable that he'll inherit Scrooge's counting house. Nor do we hear that Scrooge invites the Cratchit family to reside with him inside his massive, empty mansion. Presumably, they'll have to stay inside their overcrowded home. The contrast that the novel draws between Scrooge's wealth and the Cratchit family's poverty makes it easy to forget the fact that Dickens is portraying a comparatively small part of the socio-economic spectrum. A Christmas Carol centers almost solely on the interests of the middle and the upper middle class. Unlike many people of his time, Bob Cratchit can read and write. He also makes 15 shillings per week, or £39 per year, a salary that places him comfortably within the upper quartile of early Victorian wage earners. In this context, the Cratchit family's economic hardship, like that of Dickens' parents, stems more from their large household than their tiny income. They may not have much food to eat on holidays, but they're never in danger of starving. As for Scrooge, readers are told he manages a counting house, which means that he's some kind of moneylender or investment banker. It's reasonable to infer that he's accruing profits from the country's railway mania. Nonetheless, his firm is small. He has just one employee, and it's hard to imagine that his personality endears him to new clients. Although Scrooge is rich enough to buy a mansion, Dickens implies that his money derives mostly from penny pinching. Unlike Britain's wealthiest elites, he doesn't own a country villa, hunt foxes, or buy a seat in Parliament. Even if these things suited his stingy nature, it's very doubtful that he could afford them. Because the economic difference between Scrooge and Cratchit is comparatively small, Dickens can uphold brotherly love between Christians as a more effective method of reform than labor activism. A Christmas Carol is suffused with vague religious imagery. Concrete expressions of the book's precise denominational beliefs are harder to pin down. None of the characters are shown attending church on Christmas Day. We never learn whether they're Anglicans, or Methodists, or Presbyterians. The story's ghosts, moreover, occupy no obvious place within a Christian universe. Has Marley been condemned to hell? Is he suffering in purgatory? Questions like these are totally beside the point. Dickens advocates a broad, generic, universalizing form of Christianity rooted in charity, forgiveness, and atonement. Just as Christ advised his followers that knowledge of the truth would set them free from sin, Dickens wanted his readers to perceive the true meaning of Christmas. He optimistically believed that this knowledge on its own would be enough to save the British nation. According to the Ghost of Christmas Present, the boy named Ignorance is much more fearsome than his sister, Want. The Victorian art critic and conservative Christian John Ruskin complained that Dickens understood Christmas to be nothing more than mistletoe and pudding. I see no good reason to accept his judgment. No matter whether we agree with Dickens' politics, A Christmas Carol clearly and thoughtfully communicates that suffering results from individual sin, that personal redemption begins with bittersweet remembrance of things past, and that no human being is ever truly lost as long as they have happy memories to dwell on. Dickens hoped his novel would build happy memories and strong communities among his audience. He loved to entertain his family, friends, and fans with public readings of the Cratchit family's Christmas dinner scene. By as early as February 1844, at least 8 unlicensed adaptations of the book were running simultaneously on stages across London. These adaptations helped circulate the story to a broader audience. They also enshrined Tiny Tim as its emotional center. Ironically, the characters of ignorance and want were swept from sight, as were the awkward questions that they raised about the middle class's privilege. Even today, the scene with the miserable urchins is usually the first to end up on the cutting room floor. Reading A Christmas Carol transformed Thomas Carlyle into a real-life version of the redeemed Scrooge. On December 23, 1843, his astonished wife reported that the cranky cynic had been seized with a perfect convulsion of hospitality and has actually insisted on improvising 2 dinner parties with only a day between. Having redeemed Carlyle, Dickens knew that he could easily redeem the British nation, not to mention make a massive profit in the process. Christmas books became his most important work over the next 5 years. Later this episode, I'll explore how his annual releases became darker and more cynical throughout the hungry 40s. Before we reach that subject, though, we have another novel to discuss. Now that we've analyzed Dickens' middle-class interpretation of the 1840s, it's time to address an upper-class interpretation of the period. In the next chapter, we'll peruse a fascinating, frustrating work of fiction by a pompous author who'd eventually become Prime Minister. Chapter 6. Benjamin Disraeli's Sybil. Benjamin Disraeli might be the Victorian era's most unlikely politician. He was born in London to a Jewish family, not a Christian one. Although his parents were both British, his more distant ancestors had lived in Italy. As a child, the romantic young Disraeli daydreamed that the blood of cultured Venetian aristocrats flowed through his veins. In fact, his mother was distantly related to the Montefiore dynasty of diplomats and bankers. His father, however, came from ordinary bourgeois stock. After a spat with his synagogue leaders, Disraeli's father renounced Judaism, converted to Anglican Christianity, and baptized his children in 1817, when Benjamin was 12 years old. The newly Christian boy received a solid and severely classical education. Nonetheless, his mother kept him from enrolling in a prestigious public school like Rugby. Disraeli always regretted this missed opportunity, which prevented him from networking with Britain's future leaders. Throughout his early life, he wrestled with 2 irreconcilable urges. On one hand, a desire to fit in with Britain's ruling class, and on the other, a desire to prove that he was different from and better than his peers. Disraeli grew into a man of contradictory impulses. He used his family's wealth to pursue law, but also to speculate with huge sums on the stock market, where he lost thousands of pounds at a time. When he entered politics during the early 1830s, he knew that he hated factories, and he believed that modern England was in dire need of reform. These positions were vague enough that Parliament's left-wing radicals and its conservative Tories both courted him as a potential ally. Disraeli flip-flopped between these 2 factions until 1835, when he found himself embroiled in an ugly dispute with the Irish nationalist Daniel O'Connell. Hearing Disraeli warn that Irish separatism threatened to provoke a bloody civil war, O'Connell unleashed a furiously anti-Semitic smear campaign that rejected the legitimacy of Disraeli's baptism and accused him of being, quote, the worst possible kind of Jew. After this incident, Disraeli turned against O'Connell's radical supporters. Half from anger, half from shame, he decided to become more Tory than the Tories. His transformation tested everybody's patience. Most parliamentary conservatives were chronically uninteresting people. Disraeli was eccentric to a fault. Although his colleagues recognized his intellectual brilliance, they often found him freakish and off-putting. Disraeli liked to think that he was an artist first, a politician second. When he published so-called silver fork novels, which lightly satirized the aristocracy, his rivals never missed out on the opportunity to sneer that he was just a dilettante and arriviste who barely understood the social norms that he was ridiculing. His opponents also mocked his unbelievably flamboyant wardrobe. With magenta velvet suits, canary-colored waistcoats, green trousers, gold chains, and pomaded black curls, Disraeli looked like a Victorian Willy Wonka. You can easily imagine him spontaneously bursting into song. Disraeli was a minor figure in the House of Commons until 1842, the year of the Chartist general strike. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Robert Peel, the Tory party to which he belonged began to publicly rebrand itself as the Conservative Party. Although its membership remained essentially unchanged, its new name signified a modernizing break with 18th century ideals, including the reactionary opposition to all forms of progress. Peel identified himself with common-sense conservatism, the ordinary Englishman, and rational, incremental social change. Disraeli opposed all of this. As a result, factions began to form within the party. While moderate conservatives rallied under the Prime Minister, a stern, black-suited businessman, ultra-far-right Tories sided with a self-styled artist whose flamboyant pomp and circumstance recalled the glory days of good old-fashioned aristocracy. Disraeli's ultra-far-right followers came to be known as Young England. They stood for monarchy, privilege, and church. Pay no attention to the fact that their leader was a commoner of Jewish heritage. Pay no attention to the fact that he hadn't even gone to a respected public school. Disraeli alleged that Peel's so-called conservatives were merely Whigs under another name. In response, Peel's faction raged and ranted. Did Young England want to split the party? Were they trying to hand power to the Whigs? Or, worse yet, to the Chartists and Radicals? One moderate conservative published an irreverent poem mocking Young England's pathological obsession with tradition. "Oh, flog me at the old cart's tail. I surely should enjoy that fine old English punishment I witnessed when a boy. I should not heed the mocking crowd, I should not feel the pain, if one old English custom could be brought back again." Amid this turgid atmosphere of factional disputes, the artistically minded Disraeli published his most famous work of fiction, Sybil, in 1845. Its goal, he declared, was to paint a picture of the English nation's current moral and physical condition. Clearly, this was another novel interested in what Thomas Carlyle had named the Condition of England question. Uniquely, it was also a novel written by an upper-class author at the heart of national politics. Sybil is unabashedly a product of its time. It takes place in England between 1837 and 1842, a period defined by economic crisis, Chartist agitation, and the coronation of the youthful Queen Victoria. In the novel's opening chapters, Disraeli introduces us to the aristocratic Charles Egremont, a young, handsome Tory MP. One day, Egremont meets a pair of strangers in a cemetery. He strikes up a conversation about politics, expressing his gratitude that our Queen reigns over the greatest nation that ever existed. "Which nation?" asked the younger stranger, "for she reigns over two." The stranger paused. Egremont was silent, but looked inquiringly. Yes, resumed the younger stranger after a moment's interval, 2 nations, between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones, or inhabitants of different planets, who are formed by a different breeding, are fed by a different food, are ordered by different manners, and are not governed by the same laws. You speak of, said Egremont, hesitatingly, the rich and the poor. While Egremont reflects upon these words, he hears a beautiful voice singing a hymn of the Virgin Mary. He then spots the novel's title character, Sybil Gerard, whose long fair hair and long dark lashes captivate him. Naturally, he falls in love on the spot. As the narrative progresses, readers learn that Sybil is a lower-class commoner whose father is a Chartist factory worker. Egremont begins to spend more time with her, and she teaches him about the horrors of poverty. Meanwhile, Sybil's father pressures Parliament to enact the 6 points of the People's Charter. In the novel, as in real life, Parliament refuses, Chartism becomes more radical, and violence erupts across the country. Sybil finds herself emotionally torn between her Chartist father and her Tory boyfriend. Which man should she love? Which man's politics should she adopt? Eventually, she chooses Egremont and Toryism. Conveniently, her father and the other Chartists die, which frees her from all other loyalties. Genealogical research also reveals that Sybil, to her shock, is a wealthy heiress, not a working-class commoner. This plot twist allows her to marry the aristocratic Egremont in good conscience. Their marriage, we're assured, promises to restore the long-lost glory of pre-industrial England. Everyone lives happily ever after. Anthony Trollope, the famous Victorian writer and the son of Francis, with whom we opened this episode, coldly dismissed Disraeli's novel as a glory of pasteboard and a wealth of tinsel. This is a polite way of saying that its style is clumsy and that its substance is crude, pseudo-intellectual nonsense. Personally, I think that even Trollope's hostile comment was too generous. The characters in Victorian fiction are often mawkish and pedantic. The plots are frequently digressive and confusing. The politics are sometimes racist and elitist. Sybil boldly mixes all these flaws and then invents some new ones of its own. Why did the author give 3 different characters such similar names as Marnie, Morley, and Mowbray? Why did he introduce key plot points, then forget about them for as long as 37 chapters at a time? In 1878, when he was serving as Prime Minister, Disraeli orchestrated a disastrous invasion of Afghanistan. That could have been the worst deed of his life, but it wasn't because he'd already written Sybil. So why are we discussing a book that I hate? Well, for better or worse, no analysis of the Hungry Forties or Victorian literature at large could be complete without it. For one thing, Disraeli's remark that the rich and the poor comprise 2 nations became a famous political maxim quoted approvingly by everyone from Vladimir Lenin to Theresa May. For another thing, Sybil represents almost the purest surviving specimen of the so-called Condition of England novel. This genre, which is also known as social problem fiction, dramatized the socio-political upheavals that rocked England during the Industrial Revolution. Whereas Chartist fiction targeted the working class and upheld labor activism as the best solution for the country's ailments, social problem fiction targeted the middle class, and it rejected labor activism as a danger to the nation as a whole. Social problem fiction is a profoundly conservative genre. Within that genre, Sybil is a profoundly conservative book. Like Carlyle, Disraeli sympathized with exploited factory workers, but he also felt they were incapable of governing themselves. Instead of unions and protests, they needed stern moral instruction from right-wing aristocrats. Advertisements for Sybil often claimed that Disraeli's personal observation of the working class informed his narrative. This was an exaggeration. Disraeli had spent a short amount of time in Manchester, but almost all of his experience with the conditions of the working class derived from parliamentary reports called blue books. In other words, he'd read quite a lot about poverty, but he'd encountered very little of it in real life. What he'd read made him suspicious of the workers. Throughout Sybil, common people are repeatedly described as savage, hideous, grimy, brutal, stupid, and violent. One scene's portrayal of a labor union is so hysterically paranoid that readers who are unfamiliar with Disraeli's far-right politics could easily mistake it for parody. During a torchlight meeting at a druid's altar, forms that appear scarcely human shroud themselves in dark cloaks and black masks to induct a worker into their fraternity. The worker kneels before a human skeleton. He swears to assassinate oppressive and tyrannical masters. He vows to burn down mills and works and shops. As I discussed in episode 2, many British labor unions practiced Masonic rituals. Nevertheless, this didn't make them death cults that committed blasphemy before a desecrated altar. Most Chartists were committed Christians. In fact, many of them became labor activists specifically because their faith urged them to care for the poor. Disraeli wanted readers to believe that the ultra-far-right Tories of Young England were the only guardians of Christian faith, but this was absolutely not the case. As a novel, Sybil seeks a way to save the English nation from the Chartist menace. Its title character offers the best way forward. When this beautiful working-class maiden marries a Tory aristocrat, their union conjoins the two nations of England, rich and poor, like rival houses in medieval Europe. In 1985, the literary scholar Ruth Bernard Yezel explained why Condition of England novels usually have heroines rather than heroes. In her words, these novels
entertain the possibility of socioeconomic violence only to take refuge at critical moments in the representation of female innocence, exchanging a politically dangerous man for a sexually unaggressive young woman, and a narrative that threatens drastic change for one that proves reassuringly static.
When the radical Sybil adopts her conservative husband's worldview and bears his children, the repression of poor women through state-sanctioned marriage metaphorically substitutes for the repression of poor men through state-sanctioned violence. In the simplest possible terms, Condition of England novels imagine that a tumultuous society will calm itself once the women of the working class agree to give up their political demands and love rich men. The logic of this 19th century plot structure continues to inform more recent fiction. For example, movies like A Star is Born, Pretty Woman, and Crazy Rich Asians all exhibit variations on the Victorian social problem plot. Everything I've said so far reflects a fairly standard way to understand the right-wing politics of Sybil. Those politics, however, are actually much stranger than they seem on a first reading. That's because, in addition to being a social conservative, Disraeli was a racist in the original and most literal sense of that term. He studied race like chemists study chemistry. As a result, he believed wholeheartedly that race was real, that it was inherited through blood, and that it was the central element of human history. Attitudes toward race and racism changed rapidly in the Victorian era. Atlantic slavery and imperial conquest played major roles in this process, but so did the imagined history of England. During the early Middle Ages, migration from mainland Europe brought Germanic language speakers called Saxons to the British Isles. Then, in 1066, the Norman conquest overthrew England's Germanic kingdoms and unified the country under a French-speaking monarch. Like many people of his time, Disraeli imagined that linguistic differences reflected racial ones. According to his interpretation of English history, which was wildly oversimplified at best and dangerously inaccurate at worst, the French-speaking Normans and the Germanic-speaking Saxons were two distinct races. The Normans were haughty, dark-haired, and long-faced. They were courtly and civilized by nature. The Saxons had light hair and rough manners, but they were a hardy, manly people. Victorian racists like Disraeli deployed the Saxon-Norman myth to explain and justify the existence of wealth inequality. According to the standard argument, 19th century Britons inherited their economic status through blood from their ancestors, who were either impoverished Saxon commoners or opulent Norman aristocrats. Inequality thus corresponded to genetic traits that couldn't be undone by acts of parliament. Rather, interracial reproduction was the only possible solution to the problem. To that end, the marriage between Charles Egremont and Sybil Gerard doesn't just unite the classes, it unites the races too. Disraeli explicitly identifies Egremont as Norman. Notice his aristocratic pedigree and his French surname. At the same time, Disraeli aligns Sybil with the Saxons. She names her pet dog after a Saxon monarch, and her father fondly consumes beer, the drink of Saxon kings. In this context, Disraeli implies that Charles and Sybil's children will unite England's two nations in a racial sense, not just an economic one. Or, at least, that's what these children would have done, provided that Disraeli hadn't changed his mind or lost track of his central idea. At the end of the novel, readers abruptly learn that Sybil isn't a Saxon at all. She's not even a member of the working class. Instead, genealogical investigation reveals that she, like her lover, is a rich descendant of the Norman conquerors. Confused by its own plot holes and continuity errors, the novel ends up proposing that a marriage between wealthy elites from the same racial background offers the best way to unite two nations. Needless to say, this proposal makes no sense at all. Just like Disraeli's personality, his book is deeply contradictory. If Sybil sets forth a coherent thesis, it can only be that England ought to solve its problems by looking backward, not forward in time. Rather than Chartism and democracy, the country needed marriage, aristocracy, religion, racial purity, and the Tory party. Seen from this perspective, Disraeli's most famous novel amounts to little more than a political manifesto for young England. In the next chapter of this episode, I want to analyze one final strand of fiction from the Hungry Forties. Sybil appeared on bookshelves in the same year that ecological catastrophe struck Europe. The potato famine would bring mass starvation to the continent, Britain, and especially Ireland. Surprisingly, perhaps even appallingly, it barely left a trace on English literature. Chapter 7. Hunger in Victorian Popular Culture. In 1845, a fungal blight swept Europe, devastating its potato crop. As it returned year after year, harvests shrank and huge populations deprived of their staple food went hungry. The situation was the worst in Ireland. By the early 1850s, about 1 in every 8 Irish people had died, and another 1 in 8 had emigrated overseas. Today, in 2026, Ireland's population still remains at least 1 million people lower than it was before the famine. The Year of Black Potatoes was a fatal turning point in the history of the Hungry Forties. Because the story of the Irish famine is so long, complex, and crucial, I plan to save it for a future episode of Melting into Air. In this chapter, I just want to finish up the conversation we've been having about 1840s literature. More specifically, I want to examine how British popular culture from the Irish famine years thought about food and hunger. No book from the 1840s deals with these topics in more gruesome terms than A String of Pearls, better known today as Sweeney Todd. This novel first appeared in serialized installments published from 1846 to 1847. Scholars still don't know who wrote it, and, given the Victorian era's lackadaisical attitude toward copyright protections, that question barely mattered to its original audience. Even before A String of Pearls' initial serial run was finished, multiple dramatists had already plagiarized the narrative for bootleg stage productions. These productions and their heirs transformed the demon barber of Fleet Street into a cultural icon. As with A Christmas Carol, people today tend to know the broad outline of Sweeney Todd's story even if they haven't read the book. That story opens in London in 1785. Lieutenant Thornhill of the Royal Navy has mysteriously disappeared. So has an expensive string of pearls, which he was planning to deliver to a beautiful young woman named Joanna Oakley on behalf of her late lover, Mark Ingestry, who was lost at sea. When Joanna learns of Thornhill's disappearance, she becomes convinced that it's connected to her missing lover, whom she refuses to believe is really dead. Her investigation of the mystery leads her to Thornhill's last known location, the barber shop of the sinister Sweeney Todd, whose former assistant has been imprisoned in a madhouse after accusing him of murder. Joanna disguises herself as a boy and becomes Todd's new assistant. Before long, she discovers that her boss has been slitting his customers' throats with a razor blade and then dumping their corpses in the basement by means of an ingenious swivel chair connected to a trapdoor in the floor. In the basement, Todd robs and dismembers his victims' bodies. Then, his partner in crime, Mrs. Lovett, uses their flesh to make meat pies, which she sells for profit. Joanna's investigation into the subterranean world of murder and cannibalism eventually uncovers literal towers of corpses stacked high in underground vaults. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lovett's pastry chef reveals himself to be Joanna's missing lover, Mark Ingestry, whom the criminal couple has imprisoned and enslaved. In the novel's climax, Mark escapes from Mrs. Lovett's clutches and reveals the hideous truth to all of her innocent customers. "The pies are made of human flesh," he cries. Now exposed as a mass murderer, the furious Todd poisons Mrs. Lovett, who dies. Todd himself is soon arrested and hanged for his crimes. Joanna and Mark are reunited. They get married, and they presumably live happily ever after. Given that this is a novel about cannibalism, it's fitting that, in formal terms, the book is a cannibal text. It devours popular literary genres and repackages their grisly, hairy, bony odds and ends into an appetizing kind of blood sausage. For example, the unknown author of A String of Pearls drew heavily on Illustrated Magazine's sensational true crime stories, most of which were probably untrue. The author also borrowed liberally from melodrama, which supplied the story's tableau-style freeze frames and its histrionic monologues. Finally, the author of A String of Pearls alluded frequently to William Shakespeare's plays. Joanna's decision to disguise herself by cross-dressing as a boy would be perfectly at home in As You Like It or Twelfth Night. Mrs. Lovett, for her part, becomes a 19th century Lady Macbeth when she sleepwalks and imagines that her guilty hands are stained with blood. Another. How strange it is that I always know. The air seems full of floating particles of blood, and they all fall upon me. Off. Oh, horror. I choke. Off, I say. How the hot blood steams up in a sickly vapor. There now. Why does Todd let them shriek in such a fashion? Of course, the Penny Dreadful tradition was by far the most important source of inspiration for A String of Pearls, whose bloodthirsty villain belonged to a long line of characters like Sawney Bean the Man-Eater and Varney the Vampire. There was absolutely no room for subtlety in 19th century pulp fiction. Driven by the need to constantly outdo itself, A String of Pearls grows steadily more gruesome as its plot progresses. One of its most revolting scenes dwells upon the sight of Todd's accumulated victims. Heaped up, one upon another, heedlessly tossed into the disgusting heap anyway, lay the gaunt skeletons, with pieces of flesh here and there only adhering to the bones. A fetid steam rose up from the dead, and upon the floor was a pool of corruption. Eyes, teeth, hands half denuded of flesh, glistening vermin, shiny and sleek with the luxurious feeding they there got, slipped glibly in and out of the heaped-up horror. This passage could be ripped straight from the screenplay of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like that film, A String of Pearls reflects upon the violence of consumption. The hero's name is Mark Ingestry. The villain has an immense mouth, and he's constantly grinding his teeth. In the story world, ruthless economic competition creates an urban environment defined by literal cannibalism. This metaphor remained a common trope of post-Victorian speculative fiction. Mark Ingestry's warning that the pies are made of human flesh foreshadows the much later cry that Soylent Green is people. If the general terms of this novel's political message are easily legible, we should take care when plotting out its precise limits. A String of Pearls is neither a revenge fantasy about eating the rich, nor an accusation that the upper classes are a gang of bloodsuckers. In fact, the very rich and very poor are almost nowhere to be seen. Like A Christmas Carol, the book focuses primarily upon the middle class. Todd and Mrs. Lovett are small business owners. They murder sailors in the Royal Navy, and they use their victims' flesh to feed a clientele of petty lawyers' clerks. Although the story dwells insistently on eating, few of its characters are ever genuinely hungry. The only ones who ever starve to death are locked inside Todd's basement. Nobody who's free to walk the streets of London struggles to find food. So what should we make of a novel that thematizes eating without hunger? I suggest that we should understand it as a warning about social trust in the metropolis. Whereas A Christmas Carol counsels that the citizens of London need to love each other to survive in the big city, A String of Pearls warns that they should live in terror of their neighbors. In the dark corners of the nation's capital, you can't even trust your local barber. Seen from this perspective, Sweeney Todd emerges as a rural legend about urban life. Many members of London's large and growing migrant population were the only people in their families who had left their native villages. Like some people from the suburbs or the countryside today, migrant workers often understood the city as a terrifying labyrinth defined by violent crime. In their eyes, London appeared to be a place where Dickensian virtues like charity looked naive at best and perilous at worst. The people living there would happily devour you. Worse yet, they wouldn't even do it out of hunger. A String of Pearls, therefore, says a lot about urbanization, but little about famine. Despite appearing less than 1 year after the potato blight, it's uninterested in Ireland and even politics more generally. Unlike the other literary works that we've discussed throughout this episode, it makes no attempt to mobilize middle-class sympathy, to rally upper-class voters, or to encourage lower-class readers to join protest movements. It's unabashedly a paranoid, escapist book whose message is subordinate to its sensationalism. The bleak pessimism in A String of Pearls defines the literature of the famine period. Earlier in this episode, I described how Dickens' publication of A Christmas Carol in December 1843 restored his literary reputation and shored up his finances. In this context, it should come as no surprise that he decided to make Christmas novels his main output for the next 5 years. The Chimes, The Cricket on the Hearth, and The Battle of Life, which appeared in 1844, 45, and 46, respectively, all followed the template of A Christmas Carol very closely. By the mid-1840s, many British readers had enshrined Dickens' annual Christmas novels as an indispensable part of the holiday season. These readers were surprised when 1847 came and went without a new release. Dickens had inexplicably broken a 4-year tradition, and when he finally published a new Christmas novel late in 1848, it was a far cry from mistletoe and holly. The Haunted Man and the Ghost's Bargain is by far the darkest and most troubling of Dickens' Christmas books. Perhaps not coincidentally, it would also be the last of them he ever wrote. The book appeared on shelves during the last days of a violent year. France, Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Poland had all gone up in revolutionary flames. So too had Ireland, where the famine still continued unabated. In England, finally, Chartism had reared its head for a third time. By the end of the Hungry Forties, Dickens had grown angrier and more cynical than he'd been in 1843. Apart from his disgust with European politics, he felt disillusioned by the fact that Christmas was becoming a commercial industry. It must have been frustrating to recognize that he was more responsible than anyone for turning holiday cheer into a packageable product to consume. The plot of A Haunted Man centers on Mr. Redlaw, a chemistry teacher who makes a Faustian bargain with his ghostly doppelganger. Per the bargain, the ghost magically erases Redlaw's painful memories. Redlaw, however, soon discovers that his positive emotions vanish with them. He also learns that the ghost's gift is socially contagious. Everyone he meets forgets their pain, grows selfish, and begins to shun their obligations to the sick, the old, and the needy. Deeply remorseful, Redlaw begs the ghost to take back its poisonous gift. The ghost agrees only once Redlaw displays pity toward a hungry street urchin. Like Dickens' other Christmas books, A Haunted Man features a protagonist adrift from humanity, a poor family that embodies selfless love, an otherworldly visitor, and the terrifying image of a needy child. The tone, however, is much fiercer and more caustic than in prior works. Whereas ignorance and want are easily cut from A Christmas Carol, the starvation and death of little children is structurally integral to A Haunted Man. The hungry boy whom Redlaw finally pities is a hideous creature with bright eyes, but not youthful, naked feet, beautiful in their childish delicacy, ugly in the blood and dirt that cracked upon them. A baby savage, a young monster, a child who had never been a child, a creature who might live to take the outward form of man, but who, within, would live and perish a mere beast. Because no one has ever shown this boy a trace of kindness, he turns feral. He growls, he snaps, he snarls, "I'll bite if you hit me." The boy's entire character revolves around his mouth. Shocking sounds come out of it, and when Redlaw gives him a shilling, the poor child shoves it in his jaws because he has no other place to store it. In this scene, he literally devours money in a grotesque mirror image of the greedy middle-class adults who metaphorically devour it instead of caring for him. As the narrative draws to a close, a penitent Redlaw recognizes the boy as the only companion he has left upon this earth. The lines that follow are some of the most radical that Dickens ever wrote. "From every seed of evil in this boy, a field of ruin is grown that shall be gathered in and garnered up and sown again in many places in the world, until regions are overspread with wickedness enough to raise the waters of another deluge. Open and unpunished murder in a city's streets would be less guilty in its daily toleration than one such spectacle as this poor child. There is no religion upon earth that it would not deny. There is no people upon earth it would not put to shame." Dickens' prose would reach this furious intensity at just one other time in his life, namely, in his greatest novel, Bleak House, which appeared in 1853. That novel's depiction of the poor boy Joe reminds us that many children continued to suffer and die after the end of the Hungry Forties. Podcasts like this one have no choice except to carve up history into pieces. But whatever you do, don't make the mistake of thinking that the social problems we've discussed today vanished like ghosts at first light on January 1st, 1850. The Haunted Man became the last of Dickens' Christmas novels. Because it was too dark and angry to appeal to readers seeking holiday cheer, it never achieved long-term popular success. One 19th century stage adaptation received positive acclaim for introducing the special effects technique known as Pepper's Ghost. Today, however, The Haunted Man has long since been forgotten. Ultimately, images of food and hunger were ubiquitous in the pop culture of the 1840s, but they served very different purposes depending on the works that featured them. Mrs. Lovett's customers unknowingly ate human flesh in the big city. Charles Dickens used the sight of hungry children to condemn his comfortable middle-class readers. Despite these diverse ways of thematizing food and hunger, no major Victorian novel directly addressed the Irish famine at any appreciable length. Due to its controversial politics, the mass starvation that some critics have called genocide remained conspicuously absent from the English literature of the Hungry Forties. Conclusion: The Two Nations. If you were a hard-minded materialist analyzing Britain's Hungry Forties, then you might argue that the course of history depended on the undramatic daily work of activists who canvassed, organized, and fundraised for political causes. Plenty of historians have endorsed this materialist argument, and it certainly has merits. Nonetheless, it also overlooks the vital sphere of culture by implicitly dividing art and politics from one another. Politics, the argument suggests, is real, material, and meaningful. Art, in contrast, is ideal and less important. In defiance of this argument, this episode has shown how closely art and politics inform each other. To stage a Chartist play, you need to hire carpenters to build the set and actors to perform the roles. You need to coordinate with theater owners to secure a venue. You need to fundraise and advertise the project, print tickets, sell them, balance your books, and donate any profits to defense funds that help wrongfully arrested prisoners. By means of this labor, the brilliance of art becomes inseparable from the grind of activism. This is especially true in the context of Chartism, many of whose artists were working-class amateurs. It's also true, however, in relation to non-Chartist writers, such as Thomas Carlyle or Benjamin Disraeli. Phrases like the condition of England question and the two nations provided English readers with the language to express their era's political grievances and to articulate solutions that they thought were feasible. Art both illuminates and expands the boundaries of what it's possible to think, say, and achieve at any given time in history. Condition of England fiction's moderate conservatism and middle-class audience endeared it to the cultural tastemakers who designed national reading lists and college syllabi. Novels by Dickens, Gaskell, Disraeli, and George Eliot remain easily accessible in today's bookstores. It's much harder to access 19th century literature aimed at a working-class readership. Chartist fiction made privileged critics uncomfortable. It didn't deserve preservation, they alleged, because it was mere propaganda, not real art. In fact, the familiar 21st century assertion that art and politics should be kept separate from each other is a relic of the 19th century's culture wars. When the privileged pro-capitalist classes won those wars, they pejoratively defined politics to mean views that challenged their hegemony. Today, art becomes political only when it scandalizes powerful elites. Few things better illustrate the living legacy of 19th century class struggle than the controversial fate of Newport's Chartist mural. Created by the artist Kenneth Budd, this vast mosaic beautified a pedestrian underpass in the city where John Frost staged his fatal uprising in 1839. Newport unveiled the mural, which portrayed the Chartist revolutionaries as heroic martyrs, in 1978. 1 year later, the far-right Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher declared war on organized labor and the working class. Her government systematically dismantled union members' rights and privileges. It exported vital jobs in metallurgy overseas, and it sold publicly owned industries to wealthy private bidders. The inhabitants of cities like Newport had once flourished under an industrial economy. After Thatcher's counter-revolution, they faced chronic unemployment, stagnant wages, and downward social mobility. Thatcher left office in 1990, but her counter-revolution against organized labor never ended. Under the Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, even Britain's notionally left-wing Labour Party embraced Thatcherite neoliberalism as the key to economic growth. In Newport, the national betrayal of the working class played out against the backdrop of the Chartist mural. In 2005, the City Council proposed demolishing the work of art to make room for a shopping mall. This proposal was rejected, but in 2007, as the Great Recession loomed, an educational plaque about the history of Chartism was quietly removed. In 2013, as the Great Recession lingered, the mural was finally destroyed so that private contractors could build a mall and leisure complex in its place. One of that complex's stairways has been inscribed with the 6 points of the People's Charter. This means that shoppers can now literally tread upon the Chartist movement's democratic values as they hurry to spend money at American-owned chains like KFC and Skechers. The fate of Newport's Chartist mural reveals that 19th century class struggles still haunt Britain. Even today, the Charter's call for annual parliaments remains unfulfilled. Noble families own more than 1/3 of Britain's land. The British royal family owns approximately 1/6 of the surface of the earth. Nearly 2 centuries after the Hungry Forties, Britain remains torn between two nations, the rich and the poor. So too does the planet as a whole. In the next episode of this podcast, I'll bring our show's first season to a close by introducing you to 7 characters whose lives will trace from birth to death in episodes dispersed at regular intervals across the whole of Melting into Air. As we experience the 19th century through these characters' eyes, we'll bear their sorrows and we'll share their joys. Next time, we'll visit them as children. Together, we'll explore a Victorian dollhouse, sweep a chimney, celebrate Christmas, and recite some cheeky playground rhymes. Oh, and one more thing. We'll finally come face to face with a young princess named Victoria. I'm Brian Reinken. I hope you'll join me next time. Thanks for listening to Melting into Air. If you enjoy this show, please rate us on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. At the end of Season 1, we'll host a bonus Q&A episode, so we invite you to leave us a comment or send us an email with your questions. For more information about today's episode, you can visit our website at meltingintoair.net, where we've posted show notes, artwork, and a movie list. If you'd like to help keep the show running, please visit our Patreon for exclusive content and other membership benefits. You can always reach us at info@meltingintoair.net. This is Brian Reinken. See you in episode 7.